Hello and welcome to my podcast, Whisper in the Shadows, the true story of a real-life undercover cop. I'm Michael Bates, and I was a police officer for 15 years in one of the country's state police forces. I was also an undercover cop for over 2 years, and all the episodes of this podcast are my true stories of what it's really like to be an undercover cop. Rather, I was Michael Bates. So, full disclosure, Michael is not actually my real name. It was my covert identity I used on most of my operations. Now, everyone has a notion of what undercover policing is all about. Whether you think they are a narc, a covert operative, a dog, or an undercover cop, most people seem to confuse plainclothes police with being undercover. There is a very big difference though. Most plainclothes police don't wear a uniform, so they aren't as obtrusive in public. Being covert is completely different though. You become immersed in the world of your targets. When you're a police officer, part of your role is to investigate crimes. This means you try and find evidence to prove the person you have arrested has committed that crime. Now, this evidence can consist of physical, verbal, video, and witnesses. When you're an undercover police officer though, you are the evidence, and you are the reason someone gets convicted of the crimes. That is both exciting and dangerous. So, why don't we get on with the next episode? Thanks for joining me again on the podcast. This is episode 15 of the Whisper in the Shadows podcast, where I tell my stories from when I worked as an undercover police officer in Australia. I hope you're enjoying them. So, last week I started my third operation, which revolved around the club and strip club scene. The drug of choice was amphetamine, which was more commonly known as speed. Now, remember, my first two operations were predominantly heroin, and I knew a lot about heroin. I knew how it was sold, how to make a business out of it, what it looked like, and how to tell whether it was decent or not product. Speed was a completely different drug. It was sold differently, it was made differently, and the people who sold it were different as well. I had to take a crash course and learn all about it very, very quickly. Luckily, Betty knew a lot about it. The first couple of weeks were not only spent going out and being seen, but downloading as much information from her as I could to at least sound credible when it came time for me to buy the stuff. As I did with heroin, maybe we should take a bit of a dive into what speed is, that notorious stimulant that's been making waves for decades. First off, let's talk about how speed is made. Now, I'm no chemist, but I'll try and break it down for you. Speed, also known as methamphetamine, is typically cooked up in makeshift labs using a mix of pseudoephedrine, the same stuff you find in cold and flu meds, and then a mix in a cocktail of chemicals including acetone and hydrochloric acid to whip up a batch of the good stuff. It's not exactly a gourmet recipe, but it gets the job done. As for the type of person who cooks speed, think Walter White from Breaking Bad. Well, actually, anyone with a basic knowledge of chemistry was doing it in the mid-1990s. As a police officer based in the inner city, I went to a number of jobs where motel rooms had been destroyed by someone renting it for a few nights and then using the stove in the kitchenette to do a basic cook-up. I can't be certain, but in the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of motels had kitchenettes as part of their room designs, usually a stove and a sink in one corner. In most inner city suburbs, those motels have all had their motel rooms remodeled, and I suspect one of the reasons was to take away the ability to cook speed and thus damage, at best, or blow up, at worst, the hotel room. You could always tell when a room had been used for a cook-up. Firstly, there was this horrible chemical smell. Secondly, the stove was usually damaged beyond repair with burnt chemical substances all over it. This was because invariably when they boiled up the substances, it would boil over and cause chemical scars on the stovetop. The fact that we never had one actually blow up was more through good luck than anything else. I would think that most weeks there would be at least one cook-up being done over a number of years in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, during the mid-90s in Australia, sourcing ingredients for making speed typically involved obtaining precursor chemicals such as pseudoephedrine or ephedrine. These chemicals were commonly found in over-the-counter medications like cold and flu remedies or nasal decongestions. People would often purchase these medications in bulk from pharmacies or retail stores, sometimes using fake IDs for multiple purchases to avoid suspicion. Or They'd just break into them and steal them in large quantities, because to get enough precursor you needed a large amount of cold and flu tablets. This is probably also why you can't buy multiple packets now, and they are usually kept locked up in the drug section of pharmacies these days. Now, additionally to cook-ups themselves, clandestine drug manufacturers would acquire other chemicals and solvents from various sources, including agricultural suppliers, chemical supply companies, and even online suppliers. These chemicals were then used in makeshift laboratories to produce methamphetamine through a process involving chemical synthesis. These were large scale. The illicit production of speed in clandestine labs was illegal, and law enforcement agencies worked to crack down on the production and distribution of these substances. Over time, regulations on the sale of precursor chemicals tightened, making it more challenging for individuals to obtain the necessary ingredients for manufacturing speed. I think about the time when you went from being able to buy as many packets of cold and flu as you wanted to only one at a time. Now, how do people use speed? Well, there's no shortage of methods. Some people like to pop it in a pill form, ecstasy maybe, while others prefer to crush it up and snort it for a quick hit. And then those who will go all in and inject it directly into their veins, a lot like heroin. However it's consumed, speed zooms straight to the brain, unleashing a rush of energy, heightened alertness, and a euphoric high. Now, let's take a trip down memory lane to the drug scene in the mid-1990s. Back then, speed and heroin were like the odd couple of the underworld, each with its own unique vibe. Speed was the life of the party, the go-to pick-me-up for those looking to dance till dawn. It was everywhere, from raves to nightclubs, fueling a frenzy of activity. It was like the energy drink of the scene. It kept you buzzing and partying all night long. But where does one even find speed? It's not like you can stroll into your local pharmacy and pick up a pack. No, it's more of an underground affair. Dealers would peddle it at parties, clubs, or through discreet channels. And as for the price tag, well, that varied depending on factors like quality and location. You might fork out anywhere from $30 to $150 for a gram, depending on the purity and things like that. In the 90s, speed would typically be packaged in small quantities for distribution. These packages varied depending on the scale of the operation and the preferences of the seller. Some of the common packaging methods were plastic bags or baggies. Speed would often be packaged in small plastic bags or Ziploc bags. These bags could hold various amounts ranging from a few grams, up to almost an ounce. Folded paper wraps. Another method involved wrapping the speed in small squares or rectangles of paper, which would then be folded and sealed. Think the heroin envelopes I used to talk about. This method provided a simple and discreet way to package the drug. Caps or gel caps. Now, speed could also be encapsulated in gel caps or emptied capsules and filled with the powdered drug. This method offered a more controlled dosage and was sometimes preferred. It was also easier to hide in a bag of container of pills, as opposed to carrying around a small baggie. Balloons or condoms. I love this one. In some cases, speed was packaged in balloons or condoms to conceal it from detection during transportation. This method was often used when smuggling operations or transporting large quantities of the drug. Now, it's important to note that packaging methods could vary based on the preferences of the seller, where the intended market of where it was being sold, the level of sophistication of the operation, i.e. large-scale operations or do-it-yourself cook on stoves. Additionally, the packaging evolved over time as dealers adapted to changes in policing tactics and market demands. Now, as we've already seen, on the flip side, heroin was more like a silent whisper, luring users into a state of blissful oblivion. It was the escape route for those seeking solace from the chaos of the world. But despite their differences, speed and heroin shared one thing in common. They both cast a shadow over Australia, fueling a surge in addiction and crime. So, what type of person used heroin versus what type of person used speed? Now, it was influenced by various factors, including cultural dynamics, socioeconomic conditions, and the availability of the drug. Basic general observations go like this. Heroin was generally used by urban and marginalised communities. Geez, I'm sounding very professional, aren't I? So, During the 1990s, it was very prevalent among individuals from urban areas and marginalised communities. This could include populations experiencing poverty, homelessness and social disenfranchisement. Now, the people I dealt with were, when I was buying heroin, were from low socioeconomic backgrounds, housing commission areas, people who were always on the dole, people who didn't really have jobs. It was predominantly an older person's drug, but as I've said previously, in the 90s, there was an increase in heroin use among younger people, including teenagers and young adults. I was only in my early 20s. The people we were dealing with, and I've spoken about in other podcasts like the interview series with Keith Banks, where he was with someone who he thought was 18 but was only 14. So it was obviously being sold to younger people as the decade went along. So the reason for that was that the perception of heroin was a glamorous or rebellious drug. And obviously heroin was prevalent among incarcerated populations, i.e. people in prison, correctional facilities. If you couldn't get heroin in jail, then there was something wrong with you. As I've previously, heroin was generally sold by a few groups in designated areas. You genuinely bought heroin in the same geographic area where you lived. It was sold either on the street or you would go to someone's house to buy it. The deals were often very discreet, and the networks used to distribute the drug were generally highly skeptical of newcomers. Speed, however, was a different beast. It was a party drug. Whilst it was sold in larger amounts in secrecy per se, the drug was generally sold in clubs and raves by anyone who could find a supplier. As I mentioned before, you had two types of cooks: those who did it themselves, where the purity of the drug was questionable at best, through to a large criminal organisation where the drug was made the same way each time, generally with the same consistency and sold in larger quantities to dealers to on-sell again in clubs. Again, generally, you could classify users as recreational users, so speed was commonly used by individuals seeking increased energy, alertness and euphoria, i.e. when you're clubbing. This could include recreational users using speed to enhance social experiences or to stay awake and stay active for extended periods, particularly in nightlife and party scenes. Think strippers. Students. During the 1990s, speed was prevalent among young adults and students. It was cheap, it was easy to get. Sometimes students would use it to enhance cognitive performance, concentration and productivity, particularly during times of academic stress. And blue-collar workers. Speed was also used in physically demanding professions. People would use it to improve endurance and performance during long shifts or to cope with the demands of their jobs. Think long-haul truck drivers, long-haul bus drivers, although there's not a lot of those now, that sort of thing where people needed to stay awake for extended periods of time. So it's important to note that the descriptions I've just given provide a general overview, and there obviously is an overlap between the users of heroin and the users of speed. Now, police were always on high alert, cracking down on drug rings and illicit labs popping up across the country. Police were employing various strategies to combat the problem, from undercover operations, to targeted raids and things like that. Look, but the question still remains, did it work? Well, the answer isn't so clear-cut. While police efforts did succeed in dismantling some drug operations and putting dealers behind bars, the demand for speed and heroin persisted. In many cases, the crackdown simply led to a shift in the market, with new players stepping in to fill the void left by those who were caught. Reason for that is there was good money in it. And let's not forget the human cost of these enforcement strategies. Families were torn apart, communities were ravaged by addiction, and individuals faced severe consequences for their involvement in the drug trade. Now, while the intentions behind the police efforts were noble, to protect public safety and combat crime, the reality is that they often fell short of addressing the root cause of drug abuse. I guess the question can be, is it the police's responsibility to address the root cause of drug abuse, or is it the government's? I have my own opinions on that. I won't go into them here, but it's a very worthwhile question. Okay, so where does that leave us today? Well, the drug landscape has evolved since the 90s with new substances emerging and old ones fading in obscurity. But the underlying issues, addiction, poverty and social inequality remain as pressing as ever. It's important to approach the issue of drug abuse with compassion, understanding and a focus on harm reduction. That means providing support and resources for those struggling with addiction, investing in education and prevention programs, and addressing the underlying social determinants that drive people to seek solace in drugs. It's also crucial to recognise that the criminalisation of drug use and possession often exacerbates the problem, pushing people further into the shadows and away from the help they need. Instead of treating drug addiction as moral failing or a criminal issue, we need to approach it as a public health issue, one that requires a multifaceted and compassionate response. Now, I have no concerns with the fact that I locked up dealers by working undercover. The bit players who were users and got picked up, yes, there is some, remorse in the fact that they were caught up in this with no way out, and the government didn't provide them with a way out. My job was to enforce the law of the time. My job was to catch the Mr. Biggs. I think that as it says, there's a requirement for a multifaceted and compassionate response, and we need to see that more today than ever. All right, I'll get off my high horse now and get back to the story. So, the main targets for this operation were two brothers who were allegedly very big in the sale of speed. There wasn't a lot of information on where their product was coming from, whether they were manufacturing it or whether they were the wholesalers, if you like, of the product after it had been manufactured. But they were my primary targets. I would have a few people that would branch off from these two, but I had them as a main focus. As I have said previously, when an operation is first put together, the information on the informant gives you is vetted, corroborated, and then it forms the basis of where you want the operation to go. You want to get an introduction to the targets, build a relationship and have them sell drugs to you, give you more information and also hopefully lead you up the hierarchy of the syndicate or criminal group. I knew that these guys weren't involved with the bikies. Their backgrounds were more ethnic than that. Their names were Yakov and Bogdan. Now, both Yakov and Bogdan lived on the south side of the city. Both were married and both had children. Both also had a penchant for strip clubs, where they met Betty. It seemed that both also had a penchant for having sex with her as well, with the exception that she was really a he. Betty insisted that they weren't gay. She could just give them something sexually that their respective wives either couldn't or wouldn't. Now, I have to admit, I didn't pry too much into that part of their relationship. I let my imagination go only so far, and I was very content not to know any details. But they would take her on dates, take her to a nice hotel, spend lots of money on her, give her drugs, and obviously have sex with her. Now, I would suggest that Betty was dealing for them and making money that way as well. I never saw it, and she never said she did, but come on. She was managing clubs where speed was a big part of the scene. She was using, and she knew a lot of people who did sell them. It would make sense. The thing I found interesting, more than that they aren't gay, they just have sex with a man bit, was that apparently they didn't know the other was doing the same thing with Betty. It was completely secretive. Well, right up until they were both arrested at the end of the operation, and that detail may have been dropped on them. Anyway, the way I had to meet them still brings tears of laughter for the absurdity of it all to this day. Okay, so if you will cast your mind back, part of this operation was a requirement where I had to be Betty's toy boy, which would mean I was gay. Well, okay, bye, because of the reactions I had when I was with the strippers. The problem was going to be, how would I handle the situation if one of the targets decided I was cute enough for them too? We, Betty and I, didn't think this would be a real issue. The brothers were in denial and rationalised their sexual preferences by pretending Betty was female, labelling her such with female pronouns, and also that she wore female clothing. The whole male genitalia bit was glossed over. I obviously was the male or the top in any relationship. and they definitely wanted someone who identified as a female and was a bottom. But it was a cause for some anxiety right through my dealings with them. So I have built this up enough now. It's time to tell the surreal story of how I first met Yakov and Bogdan. Betty had to make a number of calls and invite them both over to discuss the prospect of doing business with an unknown person. Now, that person was going to be me, but on the first meet, we weren't going to let that slip. They decided that they would come to her apartment to hear her proposal. I was going to be there and be introduced as the boy toy, and generally be introduced as the person wanting to buy the speed and sell it to some clubs I worked for later. Not a bad plan, you were thinking to yourselves. I agree. It was a great plan, but this is where things started to get weird, at least at the initial meeting. It was a Thursday night, and I had spent the day buying a new outfit that was going to be fit my standing. I had a pair of grey Jag jeans, an off-white country road tight-fit skivvy with the rolled-down neck collar, and a white cable knit jumper. I looked great. I also had a flashy pair of black boots. Now, that is a lot of effort, you might be thinking. And I agree, but this was more like a theatre performance than a drug buy. I had to not only play the part convincingly, I had to look the part. And according to Betty, I was very sexy. Okay, I threw that in. But she thought I did look good. Okay, I threw that in too. I passed for being gay, or bi, as it turned out, which was what I was going for. Now, I'm sure most of you listening will have seen the Star Wars movies. Maybe not all 17 of them. Maybe not all 17 of them, I think we're up to now, but at least the 3 original. In the Return of the Jedi movie, there is a scene where Luke Skywalker meets with Jabba the Hutt in his lair. Jabba is sitting up on the dais, looking resplendent in his robes and jewels, and chained to the dais we find Princess Leia. She is wearing a very provocative outfit, and Jabba has the ability to pull her by the chain back to the dais where he can touch her, pat her head, whatever he wants to show he is in control of her to Luke or anyone else for that matter. He was portrayed as a powerful crime lord, and Leia was his prize and his plaything. Have I lost you yet? No? Okay, good. Where I'm going with this is here. Betty's lounge room was set up with 2 large armchairs at one end. Then, at the other end of the room were 2 smaller settee-type chairs, and beyond that was a dining table. Whenever I came over, Betty would always be sitting in one of the chairs, the same one every time. Where it was positioned, it was almost like she was holding court. I had been there all afternoon, and we had discussed and planned how the night was going to run. The brothers were due to arrive at about 8 p.m. This was after their business had closed and they could get away from their families for other business meetings. They arrive and Betty goes to the door and greets them. She walks them into her throne room and introduces me to them. Yakov, Bogdan, this is Michael. He is my friend. I held out a limp hand and said, "Hello, nice to meet you." To their credit, both took it and firmly gripped it and shook it. I had to remember to not be forceful back with my grip and leave it as limp as possible. I was being submissive. "And why is Michael here?" Bogdan asked. He was the older of the 2 brothers. "He has been here visiting and he isn't ready to go home yet. He knows what I do. He even sells a little bit himself. You don't need to worry about him, darlings," Betty replied. Everyone goes to sit down, but actually waits for Betty to sit down first. The brothers sit on the settee opposite Betty. I sit down on the floor. I end up sitting down with my legs folded to one side in front of me, with my right side shoulder against the front of the chair. I am literally sitting at the edge of the right armrest, right next to Betty's hand. She could have and did periodically reach out and pat my head, to which I simply looked at her and smiled. It was almost as if I was her pet cat or dog. For the next 30 to 40 minutes, I am sitting in this position a la Princess Leia in Return of the Jedi, being the attentive boy toy. So, during the conversation there was discussion about selling product, amounts, and large amounts were discussed. They talked about who they were using, talked about wanting to meet this person Betty mentioned, especially if they can move large amounts in the strip clubs. You see, a lot of strippers use speed to get through their nights. Partygoers also use speed to make their nights better. Strip clubs were a prime place to sell the drug. At the end, it was agreed they would discuss the proposition to meet a new buyer, and then they'd come back to her. We had one last drink, and after about 40 minutes to an hour, the brothers left. The bait had been taken. They were very interested in meeting me, even if they didn't actually know it was me. Thankfully, neither of them had made a passing glance at me the entire time I was there, so I was pretty sure there would be no issues with them wanting to have sex with me. Betty and I had a few more drinks before we went out to one of the clubs. We went to her usual hangout that night, but also to another club, which was owned by the brother of a notorious underworld figure. Betty had something she needed to do there, so I went along for the ride, so to speak. I was sitting in the main stage area having a drink and chatting to the bouncer. He eventually left when the club manager came in with what appeared to be a new girl. The manager had seen me before with Betty, so knew of me. I don't think she was convinced of who I really was, though. Anyway, this young woman she had with her, it was her first night stripping, obviously. She went up on stage and started to perform her routine. It was a bit clunky, as you would expect. There were about 5 people in the club, and all of them except me had girls with them. She finished her routine, got a round of applause, well, I clapped, and she rushed off stage and out to the dressing rooms to get changed or dressed for her stint at trying to get some of the punters to buy a lap dance. It's important to understand that most girls who strip only make money through the tips they receive when they are on stage or through doing lap dances. The routines they do on stage, they get nothing for. It is kind of like their social media and advertising account all in one. If a punter sees something he likes on the stage, he generally then pays the club for that girl to do a private lap dance. Now, depending on the club, that has many outcomes. But the club takes a certain percentage of the private dance fee and the stripper gets to keep the rest. Nowadays, they even have their own ABNs to ensure they are paying taxes to the government. Not so much back then. Okay, so remember me telling you about the girl that went a little bit too far? This is the night, but as we are out of time, that will be a story for next week. Look, in my episodes, I've been putting out the call for any ex-undercover police who want to tell their stories to get in contact. Whilst I've had a few, in fact, there are another 3 coming up in the next month, I've decided to open the interview series up to talk to police in general. So if you are currently or have been a police officer anywhere in the world, and you would like to have a conversation and discuss your journey, your stories, and your experiences, then please send me an email at whisperintheshadowspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and I will speak to you again next week. Thank you for listening to Whisper in the Shadows, my true stories of a real-life undercover cop. I hope you've enjoyed that episode. In the next one, we'll explore more exciting stories from my operations. Please make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Lastly, if you're an ex-covert operative or undercover police officer, I would love to chat to you about your experiences. Or if you're feeling dangerous, tell your stories on my podcast. Please get in contact by my email, which is whisperintheshadowspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to you joining me next time.